Hi, I'm Greg Farrar, and this is my daily-ish live stream of COVID-19 trends for June 25th, 2020. I'm guessing that I will be spending a fair bit of time on the states this time, like I did last time, because the states of the United States really are the news right now. But I will start with the countries, and I will finish with the counties of California, and in the middle will be the section on the states of the United States. I will try to keep my chat window where I can see it in case you want to ask questions during this live stream. Wow, that's really blurry. I'm really blurry. Let me try to do something about that. I think I'm really blurry. Am I so delayed as that? All right, well, maybe I'll just be blurry today. Maybe I just fixed it. Okay, I did fix it. Great. Very important not to be blurry. So, looking at the countries, we see the United States, as always, in the lead, but problematically, we see the dots above the trend line indicating the United States is accelerating. Brazil, major player also, maybe accelerating, but really it's not clear. Pretty much on its trend line. Brazil has been doing better recently. Maybe that's a hint that it's heading in a bad direction, but not clear. India continues to look a little bad, but only in the sense that it has a whole lot of cases, not in the number of cases per million sense, which is what I normally focus on. So India is not looking bad if you adjust for population. It just looks bad because it has so many people. And the direction is maybe a little upwards. If we do adjust by population and look at the daily cases, let's just see some of these. What happened? Let's see some of these. I'm going to reload this. I've had much better luck with my graphs since I switched to using the website instead of the notebook. But I think that was the graphs freaking out. So India, from that brief glance, seems to be slightly accelerating, but it's not in the top 25 in daily cases per million. It is not a force to be reckoned with once adjusted for population. Qatar, which used to be the leader, still is actually. Bahrain as well. These are. I thought Bahrain was going to pass Qatar, but Bahrain appears to be flattening out as well. Anyway, they're both kind of starting to fall. If you look in Bahrain's graph over time, the growth over time, you see that it has turned the corner and is getting better, even though this doesn't quite show it. Chile, I think also we will find, is turning the corner. And again, this just points back to the fact that there's no news in the world anymore, which is good, except for the United States. Europe's over it. Even Sweden, let's see Sweden. Yeah, Sweden, which looked like it might be news, is failing to be news now and is dropping again. You look at the top countries, they're all shrinking day over day in their growth rate at least. Some of them still have more daily cases every day, like Panama here is still growing 2% a day, but that 2% number is shrinking. And that means they're heading in a good direction. Kuwait, that's interesting. Let's see if we see any other interesting ones here. But broadly, the news of the world is very good. There are, as I get further down here, we start to see a few more that are a little bit problematic. Maybe South Africa, but it again is trending downward in a way that's going to look better. I don't know what that is doing here. Yeah, and a bunch of other ones. We do see a little bit of the Central South America cluster, or maybe I'll just say the Americas cluster, because surely the United States is part of that now. Peru has gotten a lot better, but Chile also is getting better. Brazil has somewhat ceased its downward improvement and growth trajectory and is now holding steady at about 1%. Not much, maybe a couple data points suggesting Brazil hasn't quite leveled off and stopped growing, but Brazil certainly is not the problem that it was a week or two ago. So who is the problem? Well, apparently Kuwait is our new up-and-coming, sharply trending upwards, reasonably warm spot. Let's see, how is Kuwait doing? In terms of warmness of daily cases, 133, it is a warm spot. So yeah, Kuwait's the real deal now. Kuwait has burst onto the scene as a real player in daily cases per million. There are quite a lot of warm spots in the country of over 100 daily cases per million, but they're generally, as we see here, this graph is talking mostly about them, they're generally declining, they're generally heading towards a recovery as their growth rate drops. But two notable exceptions are Kuwait and the United States. And you look through the rest of the graph, and it's, I guess Bolivia is looking a little bit troubled. And some of these they're fairly high, like South Africa has a fairly high growth rate at 3.6% daily. That's pretty high, but the growth rate's dropping, so I'm not so worried about them. Kuwait and the United States, though, that's where it's at. Kuwait and the United States. And the United States being much larger and probably hotter. Let's see how the United States is doing now in daily cases per million. Actually, I think Kuwait is hotter. Yeah, it is. So the saving grace at this point of the United States, as I keep saying, is it doesn't have very many cases. And you might not notice that if you're not adjusting for population. But adjusted for population, the United States is still under 100 in daily cases per million. It keeps heading upwards, it keeps looking like it might reach 100, but under 100 is, or the 100 is what I call a warm spot. And if it's not 100, it's not even warm. So the United States in cases is not even warm. Yes, certain states are, Arizona, but as a whole, the United States is still under 100 and is not, in some sense, even newsworthy because there are so many others that are higher. But the thing that makes the United States newsworthy is that unlike all of those, it's growing and quickly, and all those are at least heading in a good direction. The United States isn't. So we will spend, again, a lot of time on the United States today. Plus, most people who watch this are in the United States. And I'm in the United States. Worldwide, the world continues to go at about 1% daily growth. That's not good, but it's not rising. It's flat. The most recent day, which is an average of 7 days, is actually considerably to the negative in the growth rate, 1.5% daily growth almost. But that's just one day. Mostly it's been hovering around that 1.5 number. And why is that? Well, a lot of it is because of the United States. Because though the United States doesn't have that many cases, relatively speaking, it is large, and so it contributes a lot, even if it has only less than 100 daily cases per million. That ends up being a big contributor to the world numbers, especially when places like India aren't doing anything. Do I have, let's see how India is growing, just for fun, because India is certainly something to be worried about. Yeah, so India, the news isn't good for India, except that it's at something like 15 daily cases per million. But it is growing rather quickly, around 4%, almost 4%, and it's accelerating. So in a case like this, you look at them and you say that the direction they're going is not good. They're heading for a brick wall, but they're in an airplane, and they've got a lot of runway before the brick wall. And so if they can turn this thing around in the next, it's really a very long time they have at this rate from where they've started. If they can turn it around, they may never become a warm spot. But right now they're still heading upwards, so we'll have to watch them. And the United States is kind of the same, but worse off, where the United States is growing at a rather alarming 4.5% daily growth rate. That's really bad, actually. And it's accelerating, which is also really bad. No, that's Kuwait. No, it isn't. It is the United States. Yes. what I said is correct. The United States is growing 4.5% a day and accelerating. But like India, it isn't yet all that hot. Though it's India is at 15 and the United States is at 95. The United States has been at this a lot longer and has gradually grown to a higher place than India. But United States also, if you recall that some of our hottest spots are around 1,000 daily cases per million, for instance, Qatar or even New York. The United States still has many weeks where it could turn this around, where then in retrospect we'd say it never really got that bad. Right now it's heading in the wrong direction. So let's just look, because I'm probably going to be talking about daily population testing. I'm never quite sure that this is only the top 25 countries. I never quite believe this graph, but I do at least believe it for the United States. The United States is testing as a whole about 0.15% of the population every day, and that's a good number. It's not a really, really good number, but it is a good number. Back when California was deciding what was enough to reopen, that was the number. 0.15% of the population per day is a good number. Most countries, according to this, are not doing as well as that. Now, I've been talking a lot about metaphorical immune systems, and I want to say here that, actually, I'm going to go into this more on the state level. So let me switch to the states while I start talking about this. What is becoming fairly clear to me, and this is more of a qualitative analysis than a quantitative analysis that I'm about to do here, but the sense that I get is that regions have something like an immune system, and what happens is when their cases start to rise, which is analogous to the viral count starting to rise, then they start turning up their daily testing, which is analogous to turning up the antibodies in an organism. And once the antibodies are the things that flag. They also sometimes will kill the cell, but one of their purposes in a biological system is to flag what needs to be killed. So the antibodies will bind to the antigen of the virus, and they'll just hang out there on the antigen of the cell or of the virus. I don't know actually whether it's the cell the infected cell they bind to or the virus itself, but I think it maybe can be either. In any case, they find something that shouldn't be there, something that needs to be destroyed. They flag it. And now it's got a flag on it that says this needs to be handled. And then the immune system comes online and kills it in the form of various other immune system cells. What I am seeing happen, which feels very analogous to me, is that daily testing acts like the antibody. Testing acts like an antibody, where it's what is actually detecting the disease as a whole, and it's flagging people and saying this person's infected, this needs to be needs to be fixed. Except we don't kill the person, we cure them, or at least we treat them. And so what I'm seeing is if there's not enough virus going around, then the daily testing tends to be kind of low. People don't think it's needed. Once the infections, the cases start to rise in a population, then the population, the government, and the people freak out a little bit, and they start doing all the things, which are the immune response of the region. In particular, they start turning up their daily testing. And once the daily testing gets really high, and once people are avoiding other people and avoiding coughing on other people and putting on masks and all the things that help, and then we start to see the cases decline, but the daily testing remains. And so if you look at somewhere like New York, actually, since I'm talking about it, I'm just going to flip right to the end here. I'm going to reload my page. I'm going to say, what does daily testing look like in a place that has had an immune response, metaphorically speaking, has ramped up its antibodies, which is to say testing, and is holding them at a high level. And what you see is something like New York. New York's going to be way at the top of this because it is doing a ton of testing still. So recall that 0.15 was the place where things are kind of okay. Testing is good enough. even to handle an active surge of infection. 0.15 is probably good enough. New York passed that in April. It actually did start to get its thing under control lower, so we'll see how far the metaphor goes. But New York crossed that, but it is not stopped. It's still in emergency mode. It's still manufacturing these antibodies, aka tests, at a mad rate, and it is continually checking and checking and checking. And what I think happens when this happens is that every little burst of infection gets beaten to death by the immune response here, because there's so much testing going on that it's immediately detected and immediately handled. Just as though you just had a disease and this was your body's own antibodies at this high elevated level, always vigilant, watching for the virus and stomping it down, flagging it, and letting the immune system handle it when it's detected. So what we're going to see, I think, and this is important in cases like Arizona. I'm totally going out of order here, but let me just switch to Arizona. What does Arizona's test rate look like? Arizona is the worst in the nation, arguably, right now. What is their test rate looking like? The fact they're not at the top is indicative that I'm having trouble finding them, is actually indicative right there that there's a problem. Okay, so here's Arizona's testing rate. Now, Arizona was testing at a much lower level even a month or so ago. And I'd even say they were kind of flat. There was kind of maybe a complacency going on that said, yeah, we're testing at 3.03, but it's fine. We don't have many cases. We'll just keep doing that. And then the cases started to rise, and people started to freak out, and all the immune response of Arizona came online. And you see this rising as the immune response, as the antibodies of Arizona, metaphorically, have risen there, and they're just now reaching that place where probably it's good enough to handle the infection. Now, if that's true, we're going to see Arizona peak and drop, because it now actually has mounted an immune response to the epidemic. We'll look at some other of these, but the lowness of this curve gives us some sort of a hint of why Arizona hasn't been able to handle this. It's because they hadn't ramped up their immune system proactively. They're only doing it now reactively once things really started to get bad. And that's maybe how all states will always do it. There's always been some tendency to really try to get ahead of the ball, but I think there's also a real sense that states that don't see the virus, they just don't want to spend money on it. They don't want to spend time. They don't want to lock people down. People don't want to wear masks because they're not seeing anyone getting sick. And so I think there is, to some degree, a way that this is inevitably reactive. Just like the immune system of an organism, it's just not going to make a whole bunch of antibodies for a virus that it hasn't seen, even if it's heard of it. Like, I guess we have the advantage of being a communicating race, that we actually can, or species, that we can tell each other. We can be like, psst, hey guy in the next town, I've got Ebola, maybe you should start making antibodies. And that's kind of what we've been trying to do. And we have seen that, and there is some degree, certainly, to which the states have ramped up their immune response in advance of actually seeing serious problems. But there's only so much willpower to do that kind of thing. All right, I'm just going to go straight to daily cases per million. So we still, my news is much like the mainstream news these days. I just talk about all these states that are just going up and up, and they're accelerating, and they've got new records, and they're all in the middle of the country. That's the news. I could kind of stop there, but if that's all you want to know, you can hang up now. But I'll go into the details. The short answer is things are still very bad in terms of growth rates. They are very broad in terms of the number of states affected. The Gang of Six, what we've been talking about, maybe is close to 12 now. And so we go. Things aren't getting better. However, the good news is our immune system is ramping up. So here we have Arizona at 270, still pretty bad. It's hot. It's the only one that's hot. To get some perspective here, throughout this whole multi-month thing that I've been doing, nothing's really a hot spot until it reaches 200 daily cases per million. And none of the states in the United States are there yet, except Arizona. So the good news is we have no hot spots, except Arizona. On the other hand, warm spots are something to worry about. And if we zoom in, I'm going to zoom a little below the warm spot level. I'm going to take Arizona out of it so we can see other states better. So these are states that are warm or close to it. Arkansas at 180 is pretty close to hot. South Carolina, 170. North Carolina, 150. Utah, 140. Mississippi and Alabama at 130. Georgia, a little above 100. Right around 200s, we have Texas, California, and Louisiana. By the way, Louisiana, we should look into that, because Louisiana, by all rights, should have an immune response of the sort I'm talking about. They have been there already. Not maybe quite as bad as New York, but they had it bad enough about a month ago, or maybe it was even 6 weeks ago. They had it bad enough, and they recovered, and so we'll take a look at Louisiana. But my guess is we're going to find that though Louisiana is a rising, it is a rising, slightly rising warm spot. I think that Louisiana, we're going to see, it's never going to get hot, and it's probably not even, well, it's going to get warm, I guess, because it's already there, but I'm guessing that Louisiana will be able to stomp this out because they have their infrastructure in place. They have the immune response that they built up 6 weeks ago. Texas, Louisiana, and California then are right around warm spot, and then we have a few that are close. Nevada? I think it's Nevada. I just read an article a little bit ago about how people pronounce it wrong, but I now can't remember which way is wrong. I think it's Nevada. Put it in the chat if you know. Tennessee, Florida. Upcoming, those three. And also, those are ones that do not have a history of spiking, peaking, and recovering. So those don't have the sort of immune response we'd expect from Louisiana, and indeed none of these do. California is an interesting exception, and in some sense, I remember very early in this epidemic, I looked at the numbers for the United States, and it was going sharply upwards, we're just starting to peak. And I said, okay, from everything we've seen, it's going to go sharply upwards, it's going to peak, and then it's going to decline quickly, but not quite as fast as it went upwards. And it's going to go straight down linearly to zero. And I had some very wild projections of how low our deaths would be based on that assumption. That has not happened. And the reason that it hasn't happened is that, as far as I can tell, the United States is not a country. What the United States is a collection of about 50 some countries, and each of them is having that trajectory. And so New York totally followed that. So did New Jersey. So did Rhode Island, and I think Michigan more or less as well. And for the most part, all the states are following that. You can see a couple of them right here in the history. There's Delaware. There's Nebraska. That's what states do. That's what a region or a country. It's kind of like they're separate countries, if you know what I mean. We are not a homogeneous society here in the United States, and our regions are not homogeneous, and so we end up with all the states kind of going at different times. And what we really see is a pandemic crossing one state at a time, or several in batches of states crossing the country and hitting different places at different times. So that. Now, California apparently isn't a country either, because it didn't follow that either. And also kind of this, we're just barely hanging on for a long time. And my theory on that is that California also is a collection of countries. There are at least 3 or 4 countries that really are in California, which is to say, the Bay Area is its own country, and so South goes in the north. And anyway, this is nothing new to people who live in California. We know that we aren't really one state, and that we're actually probably 3 completely independent countries. But this is the proof, I guess, that California didn't go up, level, and down, and that's because we're seeing the different counties or regions kind of stagger their recoveries. The Bay Area actually looks kind of good. It had the first quick lockdown, and it was the first in the nation really to shelter in place, the San Francisco Bay Area. And though it's not over it completely, some of the best large, well, I'd say the best large counties in California in terms of recovery are the Bay Area. So it is showing a little bit more of the up, down, and recover. Los Angeles, not so much. No, I think if we really get into it, we probably find that Los Angeles also is several countries. Anyway, I'm getting pretty deep into this speculation about what's really a country and what isn't. The point is that Louisiana, alone among these, is showing a recovery, but one that I expect is going to be quickly handled. These other ones, I think we have weeks yet for the Gang of Six to really actually level off in daily new cases. Though I think we'll see if the numbers today look like they did yesterday, that the Gang of Six, which is Arkansas, Arizona, Alabama, North and South Carolina, and Utah, those six, they will recover before this lower crowd, Gang B here. Tennessee, Florida, Texas, and some of the other ones, Louisiana, again, is a little weird. Maybe California. California is making its own rules on this. Georgia, I think what we're seeing there is a trailing wave, another wave, behind the Gang of Six, which very well might get into the 150 range in a month or so, and then it too will, one at a time, peak, decline, and we'll be over it. The good news, though, and Louisiana is going to challenge this, but the good news is nobody gets it twice. Just like once you've had smallpox, I don't know, once you've had the chicken pox, you don't get it again, really, usually, broadly. You have the immune response, and it stamps it out if you get exposed again. It stamps it out quickly. Just like that, we're not seeing a region get it again. And New York, for instance, up and recovered. Will there be another wave in New York? I don't think so. But if there is, here's how it's going to happen. It's going to happen the same way that you get the flu again 5 years after you got the flu. What happens is you mount your immune system, you recover it, and I'm not talking about strains. So let me talk about something different, like I don't know, tuberculosis, something where you need booster shots. You develop your immune response when you first encounter the disease. It's really terrible. You get very sick. Your immune system handles it. You recover, and you have this elevated level of antibodies for a long time. But that could go away in months or maybe years, depending on the disease. And eventually, when the antibody response dies away, then if the disease comes back, you're in trouble again. And it's almost, but not quite as bad as the first time. Then you have maybe half as bad, because at least the antibodies are there and your body knows how to make more. So that's what can happen in New York. New York right now is in a highly vigilant state with an immense amount of testing. Remember, testing regionally is the metaphorical equivalent to antibodies. Very high amount of daily testing. Now, New York, if everything gets fine, and if it stays fine for 6 months or 12 months, they're probably not going to be testing as much anymore. And once they stop testing, then if the disease comes, or once testing drops to 10% of it was, then if the disease comes back, they can have another wave. But as long as they're testing at this level, I don't see it happening. And there's something else in here. It's about the interconnectedness of the healthcare system and people's fear. Fear gets a bad name sometimes, but I use it in the best possible sense when I say that fear is part of our immune response here. Where in the media or in a random live stream, you learn that Arizona is terrible, and you happen to be sitting in Tucson as in your family room as you watch this. You say, "Oh no, that's me, that's us. This place is the worst in the country. We're in trouble." And furthermore, if you're in Tucson, you probably know people now who are getting sick. You maybe know people who have died. And so there's this very personal aspect that comes to you, and suddenly you personally are motivated to stay home and hide in your basement and wear a mask if you go in public. And so that part of the immune response also plays into it. And that also is what will die away in New York. New Yorkers may be pretty diligent about wearing masks now, but in 6 months, 12 months, if there haven't been any cases at all, as happened in China and South Korea, I think they got to the place where there were literally no cases, in some regions at least. it's going to seem kind of stupid to wear a mask eventually. You know, wearing a mask isn't a big deal, but it's annoying. I chafe, and maybe it's hard to breathe, and you can't exercise, and people can't see your face, and all sorts of reasons not to wear a mask, and those will start to dominate once the fear goes away. And so that's the thing to watch out for here. But I don't think we're there right now anywhere except maybe Washington State. When you look at Washington State, we sometimes see them surging up a little bit, and I think it's because they say, ha ha, everyone else got it, but we got over it. We quickly got over it. We're done. We're dismantling our hospitals and shipping our healthcare workers and test kits elsewhere. And people just don't feel like they need to be careful anymore. And that may even be true, but if the virus makes a resurgence, Washington's going to get hit with a second wave. Okay, that's a lot of talk and a lot of rather non-numerical talk. So let's get back into what I normally talk about, which is the numbers. Here we have Arkansas, South Carolina, North Carolina. Mississippi, interestingly, is now really kind of joining the Gang of Six. Alabama, Utah, though the angle isn't as high, maybe it's recovering. Okay, so the Gang of Six, those ones, make sure they're all here, plus Mississippi. Let's look at their growth rates. And first of all, step back here and notice there are quite a number of states that are dropping in growth rate. If you're below zero, you're shrinking every day. Also, more of them are rising, but there are a lot that are shrinking every day. So it's not a calamity like it appears to be for the counties of California, where every single county is rising, except for Imperial. We see a lot of rising, but there's still quite a few that are shrinking. If you look at them, those are the first wave. No, they aren't. Nebraska, New Mexico, Minnesota. Not what I was expecting. Not at all what I was expecting. Maybe the first wave has actually fallen off the hotness, and I guess they really have. Like New York isn't here. New Jersey isn't here. All right, so if we looked at this graph, which I'm not going to spend much time on because it's a terrible mess, I think we'll see more of the first wave. There we go. New York, Illinois. These are all the states. Massachusetts, New Hampshire. Okay, but the ones that are hot in daily cases per million, the ones that still have daily cases adjusted for population, that put them in the top 25, well, even some of those are getting better. Let's look then at our Gang of Six. Okay, so this, I think, I don't remember if this is the live cast or the blog, yesterday's blog that I pointed this out, but there are two of the gang that are losing steam in a good way. North Carolina and Alabama, they're not growing that much anymore, less than 2%, and their growth rate seems to be shrinking. Not much yet, it's almost horizontal, but it's shrinking. It's a little better than horizontal. So this may be an example of counties bringing their immune systems online and winning this thing. Let's briefly look down and see how the antibodies are looking for these. What was it, Alabama? Okay, yeah, I remember when I was looking at this before, I was like, darn it, this isn't supporting my theory. Alabama and Alabama and, but you know, theories are here to be disproven. The theory being that states get over it when they hit a certain threshold of testing. It's more complicated than that, but I suspect that still is the case. Alabama and North Carolina, however, I think North Carolina does support the theory. Yeah. So Alabama is actually the only one that's sort of isn't playing along with my theory. Alabama is not doing great testing. They don't have very much in the way of antibodies, in quotes. But they're getting over it anyway. And who knows why, but they are. But on the other hand, they're just barely getting over it. North Carolina is exactly fitting the trend that I've been seeing, which is when you get enough antibodies, when you get enough testing, then you start to beat back the disease. And so North Carolina here crossed that rather arbitrary 0.15 line on the 11th, a couple weeks ago. It takes a while for these things to take effect. And now, a couple weeks later, We're starting to see it turn south. Now, the other question is, if this theory is correct, then we would kind of expect Utah, Arkansas, South Carolina, and Arizona not to have reached the 0.15 line, or to have relatively poor or only recent immune response. So the rest of the Gang of Six. I'm going to have to dig these out of here. Utah, indeed, has a poor response right now, and not even rising in daily testing. Arkansas. Where is Arkansas? Okay, Arkansas actually is doing quite well. So let's bookmark that one as maybe also not playing along with the theory. Oklahoma, by the way, not doing very well also, and starting to see it's one of the Gang B that's coming online. And all right, what else do we need here? We need South Carolina. South Carolina is so far down here that I think it's going to have a pretty bad numbers in terms of, South Carolina just barely reaching that 0.15 line. All right, I'm not going to spend a lot more time on the, I could maybe actually do an analysis to see whether there really is a correlation here, but anyway, that's my broad theory. And if it's true, then certainly all of these will peak, but we'll also see a sense that they peak when their testing gets good, and they never come back as long as their testing stays good. That last one's going to take years to test, to see whether when testing rates drop, it comes back. And by then we'll probably, hopefully, have a vaccine, which is a completely different story. So anyway, we see here, as we've seen, that the Gang of Six is still growing. They're still at pretty bad numbers, 7-8% daily growth. They're still rising, but two of them are splitting off and getting better. Let's look at some of the other ones. Let's look at Mississippi, which seems to be a Gang of Six wannabe, but at a slower angle. Yeah, Mississippi. You can't tell it from that graph above, but Mississippi, though, it's risen quickly and actually is a warm spot. You can see its angle really is much less than the other ones, and it's more than that. It actually has already peaked. Let's look at here and see if we can see what the rope chart is seeing. It's hard to say from this. I think the rope chart is putting giving undue influence maybe to the 0 days. So maybe this is just a data problem. But if nothing else, it seems to be slowing down. Mississippi is not coming in at the manic pace of the Gang of Six, and it's probably never going to be one of the Gang of Six. According to this trend, it's actually getting better and is actually shrinking. We don't necessarily believe that because of those zeros, but maybe it's somewhere around the 0 line if we adjusted for those. Let's look at some of our wannabes. We have this small cluster here. They're barely warm, or not quite. They're not in the Gang of Six, but they are accelerating rapidly. Georgia, Texas, California, to some degree Louisiana. Before I get into this, I do want to get into this analysis I promised you of Louisiana. So Louisiana, as I was saying, Louisiana, for all that it is almost warm and seems to be rising, Louisiana is showing what I would characterize as an immune response, metaphorically, to the second wave. Here they were getting better, something happened, they started to get some cases, and now they're getting better again. And look at all these days where they're way down, like in the negative 10% range. Louisiana may have instantly, almost before you could even see it, beaten back a second wave right there. And now let's look at see how its testing is. Yeah, well, some theories just are meant to fail. Louisiana's testing is actually kind of miserable. It's not unless maybe the data isn't right, but we got a lot of data, so this is probably good data. No, never mind. This is the positive test rate. That's completely different. I wanted to look at this graph. Oh, joy, my theory survives another assault. So yeah, here's Louisiana. It's well above 0.15. It is doing very well in testing. Its testing rate has certainly not dropped. Back in the day when they got over it, a couple months ago, the testing wasn't quite so high, but they've kept doing it and doing it and doing it. Maybe it's around the 0.1 mark where you start to overcome the disease in a first wave. And then if you keep building, because you just never want to have that happen again, you end up in a place like this where the testing rate is, almost 0.3. It's almost twice this benchmark level. And then you see something like that, where Louisiana, the virus tried to come back, and Louisiana, to all appearances, this is long enough time that I would say this is a legit trend. 5 days here that are very low, a couple mediums, but 5 that are very low and nothing high. That is a trend. Louisiana seems to have beaten this. And I think it's because Louisiana has antibodies to it. And those antibodies are especially testing, contact tracing, and the lingering fear of the population. Okay, I may not get to the California counties at all today, by the way, but I'll just tell you they're the same as they've been. They're terrible. They're growing. Everyone's growing. So if I don't get to them, maybe I'll just briefly flash that. But this I think is more. I don't have anything to say about California yet. They're all just rising until something happens there. Maybe I should get a graph of daily testing by county. I think I have it, but the data isn't good. Anyway, I'm coming close to the end of my time here, and I want to look at these other states. So these other states, Georgia, Texas, Louisiana again is actually recovering. Iowa's also recovering, by the way, having been slightly warm. Nevada, Tennessee, Florida. I haven't heard about Tennessee. That one may be new. But the others are pretty, certainly we hear about Texas and California. Certainly we hear about Florida all the time. Nevada maybe a little bit. Let's look at them in their growth rate. Texas, California, Florida, Georgia, Nevada. Okay, and there was another one. I'm not going to go track down who that was. This is all available on gregferrer.us if you want to dig into these yourself. But this is all just bad news for these 5. These are in the rising, certainly the strongly rising trend of a first wave. These are first waves. California, it's really hard to call it a first wave, I think, but California, again, appears to be several distinct regions. But for these other ones, they haven't had it bad. They've maybe been a little complacent. I know that Texas sort of has been. Georgia, also one of the ones who they opened early. They haven't been super cautious. And California, the exception there. California's really tried and done a lot, and nevertheless seems to be doing poorly. At least it's doing better than the rest of this cluster. Maybe it'll get better soon. The latest day is not terrible. But all of these are rising, and there's nothing much to say except they're rising right now. They're rising, they're warm, they are clearly entering a what feels like a first wave for them. Now let's look at their daily testing rates. Florida, Texas, Georgia, Nevada, California. California, daily testing rates looking great, actually. It's really kind of a mystery why California hasn't gotten over it. Georgia, Texas, Florida. Tennessee was in there somewhere, I think. I'm gradually losing them as I go, but okay. So Tennessee is actually doing okay. The rest of them, they're trending upwards, though not so much Georgia. Georgia's looking kind of bad here, hovering at 0.1. But they are bringing online an immune response here. They are bringing their testing online, but they haven't managed to lick it yet. And then there's California, whose response is very good. The testing is very good, but still somehow doesn't seem to be managing it. I want to look a little bit at those in terms of hospitalizations. No, percent tested. I want to look at the positive tests for those ones. We're just kind of doing a random survey here. It feels a little bit like. But let's just look at another way of detecting whether there really are rising infections. There's still sometimes this theory that it's not the infections that are rising, it's just the testing. But within this cluster. Let's see, Georgia was one of them. Georgia. And someone else. But we can see all of these are rising. Most states aren't. If we look at them as a whole, it's going to be a terrible mess, but the general trend is downward. If we look at, I think this is sorted, by the hottest states. So this will actually give us a sense of what does it look like, what do the positive rates look like from successful states that have gotten out of their first wave. New Mexico really doesn't count for that. Or maybe they had some very, very small wave, but these are states, not so much Louisiana, because again, we're seeing that come back. I'm just randomly clicking here. If we look at the states that we know have gotten out of their first wave, like Illinois, that's what their daily testing percentage graph looks like. But if we look at states that we know are at the peak of their first wave, their first wave, like Arkansas, it's not going to be like that. Arkansas is in trouble. Florida maybe is coming online. Yep, Florida's in trouble. North Carolina, South Carolina is going to be really trouble. Alabama, all these ones, all of these gang of 6 or 12 or however many. California, again, an anomaly. California just lives in its own world. Its testing rate's okay. It's not testing. California is almost an example of this thing that people keep saying is maybe it's just because we're doing more testing. Because California is doing tremendous testing. It's one of the best. Now, it started off way behind, but it's doing great testing. And you notice its testing percentage isn't rising. It's at 5%. So what might be the case is that 5% of California has the virus. And we're just finding all those cases. And we're not actually seeing an upswing in underlying cases and infections. California is the closest I've seen when we look at the graphs to something that actually makes an argument for that theory, that there aren't really new epidemics, that we're just seeing, we're just finding new cases. California almost looks like that. It's almost like California isn't growing in new cases, but we're just doing so much testing that we're finding them. All right, so California, go away, you're weird. Texas, not following the California trend, following everyone else's trend. These are states that really do seem to have, in Arizona, the worst of the bunch, actually off the charts, literally, in its the number of positive tests, somewhere up there, probably at 20%. We've seen 20%. We saw 20% in New York. We saw maybe even 30% positive tests in New York. States that were the very worst states at or near their peaks saw 20%. And it looks like Arizona is going to go down in history as one of, well, at least it's in the top 3 now. It's right up there in the trend lines with New York, New Jersey, and Rhode Island. And no one else is really knocking on that door yet, though who knows? Who knows where South Carolina might go? But Arizona is certainly the worst. All right, so that was kind of a mishmash. I feel like I could have talked for 2 hours and really gone into all the states, but I just did kind of a smattering. I didn't talk about hospitalizations at all. I'll just briefly look at Arizona hospitalizations. Hospitalizations in Arizona. This, like the number of like the positive test rate, I think hospitalizations pretty well correlates with the actual infection rate underlying. Okay. And there's just no way that this graph is correct. I remember this. I keep bringing this up and saying, no, because there's just no way that Arizona actually is seeing a drop of hospitalizations down to 0 over the past 2 weeks. So something's wrong with the Arizona data that I'm using here from covidtracking.com. But other places, everywhere else we look, here's Oklahoma just coming online with troubling hospitalizations. Here's Alabama. Actually, Alabama's not that bad. Let's look at Texas. I think there are just a lot of states that are, no, that's right, Texas. There are a few states in this data set that we don't have data at all for. All right, let's look at some of the states we do have. It's too bad about Arizona. The states we actually can, Colorado, this should be getting better. Yeah, so Colorado's kind of weird here. Obviously, this is a iffy data set all around. Florida, trending up a little bit. I want to find, yeah, South Carolina. That should be a good one. Well, trending up a little bit. All right, I'm not going to spend any more time on this graph. I actually thought this was better last time we looked at it. It seemed like we were really seeing from our gang of 6 some real hospitalization rising. Utah is 1 rising in hospitalization, but everything I'm clicking on seems to be slightly broken, and I know that this isn't great data here. All right, I'm going to flip over real quick to the counties of California. I'll spend no more than 5 minutes there. But the states, they're still heading upwards. I have my own theory about what's driving the peaking and declining, and if this theory is correct, then the states aren't going to stay bad for more than a few more weeks, probably, given the directions of their testing. But we'll see. We'll see. It's just a theory. Okay, I'm going to go to my favorite 2 graphs in the counties. Imperial, as always, is terrible, as is Kings. Among the other ones, we have quite a few warm ones. The worst are Tulare, Riverside, Los Angeles, still trending upwards according to this, though the rope chart will tell us better. San Joaquin, Monterey has turned warm, etc. I'm going to go to the rope chart for the hottest counties, just to briefly show us that, well, this is infinitesimally better than we've seen, in that we, instead of just having 1 below 0, we have a couple that are below 0. San Francisco and San Mateo. As I was saying in the earlier segment, there's a way that California is kind of 3 different countries, and the San Francisco Bay Area is one of those. That country, which is the San Francisco Bay Area, is doing better than the rest of the state. It has some real outliers here. All right, I'm going to look at all of them just so we can't even. I guess the other good news is that Monterey, I know, is troubled. So to whatever degree that counts as one of the San Francisco Bay Area counties, it's kind of a little off to the side. It's a little problematic, but at least it's not going upwards anymore. Monterey has leveled out. Yeah, I'm not going to dig into the other 3, but suffice it to say that, I can't even remember the other 3. Santa Cruz, certainly. San Joaquin is kind of, well, actually San Joaquin is peripherally, it's close to the Bay Area. Alameda, that's the one I was looking for. Alameda is not even in the top, it's not in the top 25 in terms of hotness, and it's at least leveled. So good work, San Francisco Bay Area. We are at least holding steady, and in some cases doing better than that, like San Francisco and even San Mateo. We're at least holding steady in our growth rates throughout most of the San Francisco Bay Area. The rest of the state looks kind of terrible. Kind of. We have a lot of growth rates in the 4, 5, 6, 7, 8% range. Maybe we're seeing a little more horizontalness to this graph than we have. But the general trend I see is upwards, angled upwards. So not a good graph. San Francisco Bay Area is probably turning towards a better place. The rest of the state, not so much. Los Angeles is at least only barely angled upwards, but it's still growing 2% a day and still slightly slanted upwards. All right, those are the counties. I'm over time. Maybe I'll spend a little more time on counties tomorrow, especially if the graph starts to look different. But I came on today and saw the graph and said, that looks like the same graph from 2 days ago. It really does. It looks like the same graph with just a slight improvement. So doing these things every 2 days, we don't see much change, but I'm hoping we see some more downward trending of the non-Bay Area counties in a few days to come. That's the news. I'm Greg Farrar. Thanks for watching.